Well, thanks for joining us at Cold Case Christianity. I'm Jay Warner Wallace. Today we're going to start what I think is going to be a 5 or 6 week series on some pieces of evidence that I think are critically important and that I've started to write about in my latest book, which is called God's Crime Scene. And I'll be talking more about that as we go along. But I thought, since we've got this show every week, we might as well start actually kind of parsing through the important pieces of evidence that incline us to believe that the inference of a designer-creator God is actually the most reasonable inference from the evidence we see in the universe. Now, I'm going to tell you that this, for me, was a very personal journey. And I thought what I'll do with this first of the 6 episodes is I'll kind of launch out to you the basic overall premise of how you might begin an investigation of the universe to see if, in fact, the most reasonable inference is God, as an explanation for 8 pieces of evidence we see in the universe. Now that's what we're going to do today. We're going to start to sketch out the approach we might take. And as you know, my books, Cold Case Christianity and God's Crime Scene, are both books that take a detective's perspective on examining these critical issues. Well, why? Well, because it was my personal journey. I was somebody who at the age of 35 was not a believer. I wasn't raised in a Christian family. I didn't have Christian parents who brought me up in the church. As a matter of fact, I didn't really have any friends. I never attended a youth group, never had friends who were part of a youth group who invited me to church. I got all the way into my 30s without really having any serious exposure to the pieces of evidence that would incline someone to believe that Christianity is true. As a matter of fact, I had never even set foot in an evangelical church of any kind for anything other than a wedding or a funeral up to that point. So I was the kind of person, and honestly, I was kind of raised as part of that Star Trek generation that really believed that science would have all the answers. And I really believed that naturalism, my philosophical naturalism, was very much a part of my life, was very much the way I thought about things. And I thought anybody who has to default to this invisible God in order to explain what science is chipping away at year after year and giving you better and better explanations for is somebody who's weak-minded. And as a matter of fact, when I talked to Christians in my place of business, the law enforcement, I was working in a surveillance team at the time, the few Christians I knew, and I knew a couple who were cops, they were the kind of cops that were more emotionally attracted to Christianity. And if you asked them, why is this true, they really were not equipped or even felt it necessary to be equipped to explain why it might be true. And that, for me, was difficult. It just affirmed what I thought of all Christians, these nonsensical, non-thinking, kind of blind faith folks who must need this for some reason, some kind of an emotional crutch, and they believe this to be true, but it wasn't something I needed. As a matter of fact, I had a great life. I was the kind of person who had a wonderful experience in my marriage, had a great experience raising kids, and had a great career. Had gone to school, both graduate school and undergraduate school in the arts, and I just felt like, for me, there was no real reason to add this another dimension, another layer of, especially what I consider to be nonsense, into an otherwise thoughtful existence. And so I stayed away from those kinds of folks. As a matter of fact, I mocked those kinds of folks because so many of the people we took to jail would tell us at the point of arrest that they needed to kind of change their lives because they were Christians and they knew better than to behave this way. And they felt kind of bad for the way they behaved, but they admitted that they were Christians. And we thought to ourselves, as atheists who were working on this team, this is typical, right? These guys, and of course they think that once they pray the prayer and they're all forgiven, so they don't care what they do. And it's to us, it was like just nonsense. We couldn't buy it. And I had a lot of friends who, after I became a Christian, teased me mercilessly as partners going forward. Then they got promoted. I actually ended up in seminary, and I can tell you that 15 years after the fact, I had lots of these folks who I had known as part of the surveillance team who were now my sergeants, my lieutenants, my captains, because they had promoted. And boy, did they remind me of my non-Christian days, and they would kind of laugh at the path that my life had taken. Although many of them, years later, have now started to consider these things seriously themselves. Anyway, my point is, when I first became interested in Christianity, it was on the basis of what I saw in the Gospels that to me was so, it resonated with my own practical experience working cases where I had to interview more than one witness about the same event. And I saw parallels, things that these witnesses would talk about and the way they would talk about them that looked an awful lot like what I was seeing in the Gospels. Certain levels of what I call unintentional eyewitness support, certain things I would see in comparing 3 or 4 written eyewitness statements in a cold case to the 3 or 4 eyewitness statements or alleged eyewitness statements you see in the Gospels. So it got me interested. And at some point I felt like, well, you know, I could accept some of this nonsense, but here's my bigger problem though. When I get to the miracle accounts, any kind of a miracle account, a healing, walking on water, feeding 5,000, a resurrection, forget it. I might give you that there is some history in the Gospels, but at that point I would have said it's kind of like historical fiction. You know, history to a point, kind of like, you know, when Abraham Lincoln is portrayed as was a vampire slayer, you know, in this movie. You know, there's some historical fact in there, but there's a lot of fiction in there too. And that's what I would have said about the Gospels. But when I really stopped to ask myself why I rejected these particular elements of the Gospels, it all came down to the fact that I rejected the supernatural. And any supernatural element in the Gospels would have disqualified them for me. So at some point, especially as I kind of saw and looked at the history of how the disciples would not budge on these accounts in the first century and were willing to die for what to me would have been like, well, I can see maybe you want to die for the teaching of Jesus, but to claim the resurrection and be dying over that, that's crazy. Unless, of course, my philosophical naturalism was not accurate. And that's when the next part of my investigation began to take place. And that was into why did I think that naturalism had the power to explain the universe the way it is? I always thought it did. Now I had to actually find out, does it truly have the power to explain the universe the way it is? And that was the next part of my investigation. So what I've done here in these 2 books is in Cold Case Christianity, I've laid out for you the investigation that I went through that got me believing that I could really trust these accounts as reliable history, except, of course, for the supernatural elements. But that was what I chronicle in God's Crime Scene. Once I examined my view as a naturalist in trying to explain the most important evidence in the room of the universe, which we're going to talk about in this clip you're going to see in a minute, well, that's when I decided, you know what, I don't think I've got a good reason to believe that my philosophical naturalism is a correct description of the universe around me. So, and of course, if there is a God that could do what Genesis 1 says this God did, create everything from nothing, that kind of God could walk on water. I would imagine he could probably do a lot that is not even described in Scripture that'd be a lot more significant than the few miracles by comparison to creating everything in the universe from nothing. If there is a personal being that could accomplish that, then the miracles we see in the Gospels didn't seem all that much of a burden. And that's where I had to kind of, so it's both of these investigations, one into the reliability of the Gospel accounts, and two, into how we best explain the 8 pieces of evidence in the universe that convinced me ultimately to surrender my old views and my old pride and my old resistance and my old apprehensions and all the struggles I had believing any of this. I ended up becoming a Christian. So what we're going to do for the next 6 weeks is we are going to talk about that process, and we're going to examine, starting right here today, we're going to examine 8 pieces of evidence in the universe. But I want to begin today by giving you the approach that I embraced. This is an approach that I recognized maybe 3 or 4 years into working murders. I realized that, you know, in all these cases where we're trying to figure out how this guy died, we're taking a very unique approach. And that approach actually is the same approach I took in examining whether or not Christianity could be true if the miracles, in other words, whether or not God could exist in a universe like ours. So the approach I took at Crime Scenes ended up having a parallel, a way of applying this approach to the case for God's existence. But I want to show you that first. So what we're going to do is look at 6 clips over the next 6 weeks from an hour and 40 minute talk that I gave at Compass Church in Colleyville, Texas. They were good enough to record it, and so I've got a copy of it, and so I'm going to show it to you over the next 6 weeks in little pieces. Today we're going to talk about the approach we might take before we begin looking at the actual evidence, and we'll begin looking at the evidence next week. So this is a clip from that hour and 40 minute talk. I think it'll give you at least a broad overview of how it is we're going to look at this evidence over the next few weeks. Also, it'll give you an overview of what we're doing in the book, God's Crime Scene. All right? So let's take a break, and then when we come back, we'll start looking at this clip from God's crime scene.
Wow, you guys are the core, okay? I expect big things out of you guys because you came back for this talk, which is really going to be an overview of why we believe God exists. I just realized, were those fingerprint things on the wall earlier? That's very cool. I got to start paying attention. Okay. Now, listen, I'm not going to go back through my entire background with you guys. For those of you who were here earlier, I work in Los Angeles County as a cold case detective. I will just show you the pictures of my kids, though, because I love my kids, right? This is my son, Jimmy, who works at the same agency that I work at, and we have 3 generations. I get to go see this guy on tomorrow night. He's in Northeast Texas, in Hughes Springs, Texas, so I get a chance to drive out to see him tomorrow afternoon. Hey, how many know where Hughes Springs, Texas is? You actually know where that is? Very cool. 1,800 people strong. That's what we're talking about. So I'll be there tomorrow night. Okay, now I am going to remind you guys that we do, I just wanted you to remember we have this website, and I want you to think about downloading this because this is where we make the case most robustly is on our our phone app rather. And so I want to remind you we do have a phone app where you can download all of this. But we're going to cut to the chase now and let's get right to it. We're going to do what I call Death Investigations 101. If you were here in the last session, we talked about how we determined that a death scene is a crime scene. Remember? And we had the dead guy on the floor. Well, we're going to do that again, only we're going to turn a corner and use a certain principle I didn't talk about last service that I think will help you to make a case and examine whether or not we think God is reasonable as an inference. And here's how we're going to do it. In a dead guy in a room again, but we've changed the room slightly. Do you see it slightly different? This dead guy, we're going to kill a different way. Again, we use this process we call abductive reasoning, right? That's where we determine, based on the evidence, dead guy laying in the room, we make a list of all the reasonable inferences. So we have 2 E-lists, a list of evidence, a list of explanations. And when we list the evidence here, dead guy laying in the face, and then we list all the explanations here. So this is looking pretty familiar, right? This is what we did last service. And we taught you how you can use this process of comparing evidence in the room to explanations for the evidence to determine which explanation is most reasonable. And we know just so far that we really can't cross out anything given what we have so far, just like last service, right? But now we're going to change it slightly. Now, of course, we said, what if the dead guy was laying in a pool of his own blood? We talked about that. That's the additional piece of evidence. Now we add that to our evidence list over here, and now we've got a different kind of inference. I think we can cross out natural death, given that you really can't find a way to bleed from your center torso naturally. Okay, but then we changed it. Remember how we killed him differently last? We killed him last at service by doing what? We stabbed him, yeah. This service will kill him. What if this time we come in the room and we find him laying in a pool of his own blood, but he's got a single gunshot wound, and it's an exit wound on his back, and there's also a pistol in the room with him. A single casing. Got it? If that is the evidence we have in the room, that changes things. It's an exit wound. Now, if we look at our list of explanations and compare it to the evidence in the room, we added a couple of pieces. It's kind of hard, what do we think we have here? Is this an accidental? I think it could be. What if he's cleaning his gun and accidentally fires it into his stomach? It could be a murder, it could be a suicide. Actually, even with that additional fact now, we still can't cross anything off. Let's go one more. What if we had a note, a suicide note in his own pen, his own hand, with his own fingerprints and DNA on the paper? Some skin cell transfer. Okay, so if we had that, now we have to add that piece of evidence to our list, which we'll do right now. And given that extra piece of evidence, I don't think that's reasonable anymore. I mean, he's got a suicide note. That comes off. But do we know for sure it's a suicide? Right? Could be staged. So let's change our scenario slightly. What if we have a dead guy laying face down, bullet hole, but now instead of having one exit wound, we had multiple entry wounds, lots of casings on the floor, foreign fingerprints, not in his own hand, don't even recognize that handwriting, and this is obviously a California murder because we have a barefoot surfer getting ready to leave the room. This changes things, right? So we'll add these elements, these pieces of evidence to our E list. Here they are. And now the most reasonable inference, it's not suicide. So we can cross that off. Now, we talked about how this is called abductive reasoning. That's the skill set I wanted to teach you last service. Now I'm going to try to teach you a different skill set tonight. We actually determined that this was most reasonably a homicide by using a different technique, which if you didn't think about it, you may not even recognize it. It's some game I call inside or outside the room. So in essence, if we looked at the evidence we have inside the room, we have to explain it. If I can explain all the evidence inside the room by staying inside the room, it's probably not a murder. Here's what I mean. Here we happen to have some evidence in the room. I've got a note, but it's in his hand. It's his stationery. It's his pen. It's his DNA. That's been in the room for days. That's just his stuff. Not only that, I've got a single weapon, which is his registered handgun. It's got his DNA on it, his fingerprints on it. And I've got one bullet hole that he could have shot himself from the front. I can now explain all of this evidence by staying inside the room. And if that's the case, this is going to be something other than a homicide. It's probably going to be either not a natural, obviously, but an accidental or a suicide. What if it's different, though? What if instead I have a note that has not got his fingerprints on it? It's got a foreign fingerprint and DNA, and it's not in his handwriting. And inside the room, I also have a pistol that's not registered to him. It's from somebody else, unknown person who doesn't live with him. Unknown foreign DNA and fingerprints on it. And I've gotten several casings. It's hard to shoot yourself in the back several times. And I've got footprints that lead out of the room. Well, now I cannot explain the evidence that's inside the room by staying in the room. I have to go outside the room for the explanation. And that changes everything. If this is the case, I've got to consider a homicide. Why? Because if I have to go outside the room for an explanation, I now have evidence of an intruder. Got it? Intruders change everything. Intruders turn death scenes into crime scenes. And intruders also ought to change whatever curiosity you had about why he would have killed himself or how that happened accidentally. If it's a murder scene, this should change into a sense of urgency because you have to now go out and catch this guy, and you've got a short window in which to do it. Make sense? Why did I go through all that with you? Because what if we took the exact same approach and instead of applying it to a crime scene, we applied it to the whole known universe? Now the question is, can I explain everything I see in the room of the universe by staying in the room? We can play the same game, inside or outside the room. If I can explain everything by staying inside the room, some form of naturalism will be fine. If I can explain it with just space, time, matter, the laws of physics and chemistry, then you don't need a God to explain any of this. On the other hand, if there are things in the room that I cannot explain by staying in the room, now I've got to consider an external source. What would that be? I think there are actually 8 pieces of evidence in the room of the universe. And these 8 pieces of evidence have to be assessed. And they have to ask the question, is the best explanation for these 8 pieces in the room or out of the room? Of course, like I said, if I can explain these from inside the room, no problem. And as an atheist, I thought for many years I could explain these 8 pieces by staying in the room. On the other hand, if the best explanation is actually external, well, now I've got an issue, right? Because again, I've got evidence of an intruder. Only the problem is the intruder is on a very different scale. And this is really the idea behind this book, God's Crime Scene. The idea here is we're looking at the universe as a room and playing the game of inside or outside the room. And in this book, what I try to do is in every chapter, I'll give you a crime scene that I've really worked. A guy today on Amazon reviewed the book and he gave it a 1. First bad review I've gotten. Why? He says it was too gruesome. He couldn't read it. I didn't think it was that gruesome, although he has the audio version. I didn't record the audio version, so maybe the audio version is more gruesome than the written version. But I try to give you a crime scene in each chapter and then take that skill you learn in that crime scene and apply it to the universe. That's the nature of this book. Remember, again, we're making a list of evidence and a list of explanations. And if we do this with the universe, we make a list of evidence in the universe and a list of explanations for how we'd explain it. The list of evidence are those 8 things, which I'm going to talk about tonight. And then the explanations are what? You only got one way, inside the room or outside the room. If we're inside the room, it's some form of natural law, natural processes. If it's outside the room, it's something extra supernatural. Because it cannot be the things that make up nature, space, time, and matter.
Okay, so now you've had a chance to watch the clip from this hour and 40-minute presentation. At least it gives you a beginning, a starting point. You can see the approach we're going to take using this little device, the inside or outside the room game. And so what we're going to try to do over the next 6 weeks, and what I try to do in God's Crime Scene, is to give you all the explanations possible from both inside the room and outside the room. Now, people have looked at this and said, well, isn't that kind of a God of the gaps? In other words, if you just can't explain how this evidence exists by staying in the room, does that necessarily mean you have to go outside the room for an explanation? I think you'll see as we go over the next 6 weeks, 5 after this week, that yeah, actually the kind of evidences we're looking at and the kinds of explanations that might be necessary are going to have to take you out of naturalism as we know it. And even unpopular atheists like Thomas Nagel will say, when it comes to rationality and consciousness and all kinds of things we've talked about, the naturalism of the ordinary type, the kind we commonly think of, is not going to sufficiently explain these 8 pieces. And as a matter of fact, when I first pitched the book to my publisher, I was prepared to write 10 chapters on 10 pieces of evidence. And I ended up combining a couple of categories. You know, one of the categories I combined also, you saw in this first opening clip, the 8 categories we're going to look at, the 8 pieces of evidence we're going to look at over the next 5 weeks. But I can tell you that one of those categories I didn't even do is kind of the nature of humans. How do we explain the confusing nature of humans? We aren't even going to talk about that in God's Crime Scene, and we're not even going to talk about it in this series of 5 weeks we're doing together. But if you think about it, I recognized this right away working in my cases, is that I'm constantly dealing with people who 30 years ago did a horrific crime, and then 30 years later they haven't done another crime. They haven't even broken the law. They haven't probably even been guilty of speeding. These folks have lived a very normal, law-abiding life for 30 years after a horrific moment in which they killed somebody. And how they could do that, how somebody can be capable of that kind of heinous crime, yet then also capable of living 30 years as though they're just the most law-abiding citizen on the face of the planet, is confusing for a lot of people. As a matter of fact, I've actually talked to defense attorneys who are not Christians, who have said, you know, there's no way my guy could have done this. I mean, look at his record. And this guy's a teacher, this guy's a fireman, this guy's an engineer. I mean, I've had all kinds of folks from all kinds of very ordinary aspects of life who have lived very, very law-abiding lives for 30 years, and their defense attorneys want to offer that law-abiding 30-year history as an evidence that someone like this could never commit a crime like us. Really? This is called the enigma of man, right? That folks who seem outwardly and even can live for consistently in a very law-abiding way are also capable of horrific misdeeds. How could that be? Well, this is yet another piece of evidence I think you have to explain, either inside the room or outside the room. I think that our Christian worldview does explain this, right? Because we are designed and created in the image of a holy God capable of greatness, but deeply fallen as a result of our rebellion. And this is why we are capable. We have this beautiful yet tragically messy, tragically horrific nature that is constantly in tension, right? And that's because of what we see in Scripture describes this. But I thought that that was so specific to the Christian worldview that you couldn't really examine that from the perspective of an inside the room or outside the room kind of a thing, right? Because that's very specific. And what I wanted to do in God's Crime Scene was simply give you an overview that was available to me as an atheist. Because when I first looked at this, you weren't going to be able to convince me from any passage of Scripture, any doctrine of Christianity. You were going to have to explain to me why my naturalistic ideas for these 8 pieces were insufficient. And you're going to have to explain it to me from my own understanding what the science can deliver. And what we see repeatedly, what you're going to see over the next 5 weeks, is that the science itself cannot deliver the answers. And it's just the more we discover, the more, it's not like we're getting closer. That's the other thing. We're not getting closer week by week to answers in these categories. The more we discover in these categories, the further away we get with our scientific explanations. And that is the problem. So what we'll do over the next few weeks is just going to talk about those and lay those out for you. We're going to do 2 pieces of evidence per week for 4 weeks, and then we'll wrap it in the 5th week after this week. So I hope it helps you. And again, the book God's Crime Scene is available either at godscrimescene.com or at coldcasechristianity.com. And of course, it's available at booksellers everywhere. Every single major bookseller's got it, not only in the paperback version, but in an audio version is available at every single bookseller, and an ebook version from Kindle to other ebook like Nook. All the ebook versions are also available. So I hope it's helpful to you as you examine these 8 pieces of evidence also. All right, we'll begin that right here next week at Cold Case Christianity.